emission and absorption spectrum. This spectrum, this is one of the property of light, and there are two types of spectrum. Some spectrum are called emission spectrum and some spectrum are called absorption spectrum. So first time I'll tell you what is emission spectrum. Emission spectrum means, suppose this is a source of light. Suppose this is a source of light. When the radiation of the light, first time you have to pass through a prism. Suppose this is a prism, you know about prism, in physics you have got. This is a source of light. When the light is passed through a prism, and after passing through the prism, when you observe the light in a photographic plate, this is one example of photographic plate. This is one example of photographic plate. Then in the photographic plate you can see the spectrum. So to get the spectrum, first thing, the light you have to pass through a prism. After passing through the prism, you have to observe in the photographic plate. Then in the photographic plate you can see the spectrum. And this type of spectrum, when the light is passed through a prism and then received on the photographic plate, this type of spectrum is called emission spectrum. So the definition of emission spectrum: when any source of light is first passed through a prism, and then received on the photographic plate, comma, the spectrum obtained is called emission spectrum. So this is one example of emission spectrum. Now, depending on the source of light, what type of light you are using, whether the light is white light or colored light, based on that you will get two types of emission spectrum. One is called continuous spectrum and one is called line spectrum. So what is the difference between continuous spectrum and line spectrum? These are both are emission spectrum. Number A, continuous spectrum. What is continuous spectrum? When you use white light, and the white light, first time you have to pass through a prism and then you have to receive on the photographic plate. And in the photographic plate you can see 7 band of colors from violet to red. VIBGYOR. Violet, indigo, blue, green, yellow, orange, red. You will get 7 band of colors. This type of spectrum obtained is called continuous spectrum. So this is one type of emission spectrum. Emission spectrum again classified into two types. One is called continuous spectrum and another is called line spectrum. So how these are classified? Based on the source of light, whether the light is white light or colored light. If we use white light, then you can see the 7 band of colors in the photographic plate from violet to red. And this spectrum, this 7 band of colors is considered as spectrum, and that spectrum is said to be continuous spectrum. And why this is called continuous spectrum? Because in between the color there is no gap, there is no dark space in between the color you will get, and that is why the colors are continuously from one color to another color, and that's why there will be no dark spaces in between the colors, and that's why this type of spectrum obtained are called continuous spectrum. Now another spectrum which is called line spectrum, that is number B. This is called line spectrum, LINE, line spectrum. To get the line spectrum, you have to use some colored light. For example, you are using yellow color light. When the light is passed through the prism, after that, when you receive on the photographic plate, then you don't get this type of 7 band of colors. Instead of 7 band of colors, you will get, this is your photographic plate, and in the photographic plate you can see some colored line like this. These are colored line. That's why the spectrum is called the line spectrum. These are colored line, colored line, and these are the dark space. These are dark space. This is also dark space. So here in between the line you will get some dark spaces, and that is why this is not said to be the continuous spectrum. So when colored light is passed through the prism, after passing through the prism, when you received in the photographic plate, then you in the photographic plate you will get some colored line, and in between the colored line you will get the dark spaces. So this type of spectrum obtained is called line spectrum. If you use yellow color light, then the line you will get yellow colored line. So depending on the nature of the light, what type of colored light you use, based on that you will get the colored line, and in between the colored line you will get the dark spaces. So this is about the line spectrum and continuous spectrum. Both are emission, and what is the difference between continuous and line spectrum? To get the line spectrum, to get the continuous spectrum, always white light is used, and to get the line spectrum, always colored lights are used. And in continuous spectrum there will be no dark space in between the colors, but in line spectrum some dark spaces are obtained in between the lines. Normally atoms always produce colored light, and that is why atoms always produce this type of line spectrum. For example, you know sodium metal, when sodium is heated in flame it gives yellow light, and if that yellow color light is passed through the prism and when you receive on the photographic plate, then you can see some yellow color line in between the dark spaces. So like this way you will get the lines, and these lines are called the your line spectrum. Always remember, atom generally produce colored light, and that is why atoms always shows line spectrum. So this is about the emission spectrum. So emission spectrum two types, continuous spectrum and line spectrum. Thank you.